Thank you so much, Joelle. It is such an incredible pleasure to be here. I've known Marion for quite a few years now. Just adjusting myself. And I was here before COVID, I think, and then of course we had this big interruption. So it's incredibly lovely to be back again, and especially with such nice weather, and the sales have just started, so I've been having a very nice time. It's terrific to be here. I'm just wondering about progressing the slides. Is there a, oh. So I can just use this. All right, perfect. Okay. Ah, this is me a little while ago. These are my declarations, just so people have that. So what I'm going to be talking today about is nutritional psychiatry. So I'm going to give you an overview of the work that's been done in the field, some of the things that are underway at the moment. Frustratingly, we have many studies that were delayed because of the COVID lockdowns, and in Victoria we had, I think, the longest in the world. And so many of the trials that we had to put on hold were finished last year, which means that the results are in the process now of being analysed and published. So there's a lot of things that I can't talk about in great detail, but I can just give you a general sense of what we've been doing. But nutritional psychiatry, it's where we really bring together two of the leading causes of global illness, early death, disability. So we know that unhealthy diet is the leading cause of illness and early death now across the world. So poor diet and its sequelae, high blood glucose, high blood pressure, etc. These are the things that are killing people more than infectious diseases, and this is now right across the world. And we also know that mental disorders are one of the leading causes of global disability everywhere, particularly the common mental disorders. These are depression and anxiety. And in many countries, we've had a lot of investment for a lot of time now, maybe over a decade, certainly in Australia, in increasing access to treatment and reducing stigma, but we still don't see any change in the level of depression, anxiety in the population, and of course during COVID it's gone up considerably. We've also had no new treatments for decades. Not really, not any really good new treatments. So we really need to be thinking about a different approach that involves prevention, something that can help people at the whole population level. So nutritional psychiatry brings together these two leading causes of global disability and illness and burden. It looks at nutritional approaches to both the prevention and the treatment of mental and brain disorders and their comorbidities, and then the application of this, how we get this into clinical practice, how we get this to improve the health of the population. And Tetiana Roxy, Dr. Tetiana Rox is the leader of our Food4Mood Academy, and she's going to talk quite a bit about how we might actually apply this new evidence in practice. So it has large implications for clinical care, for public health prevention, and for policy. And I know I'm involved in a lot of different areas now across the world where things are really shifting, and we're seeing big changes in the way we think about psychiatry, because traditionally psychiatrists and psychiatry have not really thought much about what happens below the neck, you know, as if the brain and the body are somehow disconnected. But we now know we're, of course, one highly sophisticated, highly integrated system, and that every system is involved in one way or another. And of course what you eat is the petrol, it's the foundation, isn't it, of virtually every single thing that happens in your body. What nutritional psychiatry isn't is complementary medicine, integrative medicine, alternative medicine, functional medicine. Many of these terms, it may not be the case in France, but in many countries these terms have a loaded connotation because they have tended in the past to not have a strong evidence base. And what we're really concerned with is generating very, very good quality evidence, because it's this sort of evidence that changes policy and changes clinical practice. So this is what we have been doing since the start. The work we've done has had a very big impact at the level of the public. So our work is represented in all the major media around the world very regularly, including documentaries and television shows and, you know, Oprah magazine and these sorts of things. Why is this? Because everybody cares about mental health. Everybody has a brain. Everyone's worried about brain aging. Everyone's worried about the mental health of their children. Everyone's worried about how to optimise their brain so that they can think and learn and remember and do their jobs well. And everybody eats several times a day. And the fact that these two things are linked gives people hope, because it means that they can take something for themselves and change something themselves, because many of the factors that influence mental health are outside of people's control. So we now have a very large and consistent body of evidence from right across the world. We have Dr. Tasneem Akbarali here, who I first met. She and I published some of the first papers on diet and mental health way back in 2009, 2010, and we've known each other since then. And the epidemiology is highly consistent. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about a healthy version of a French diet, or a Mediterranean-style diet, or Australian diet, or even a Chinese diet, or a Japanese diet. Foods and diets that are higher in whole foods, unprocessed foods, plant foods, these diets are over and over again associated with a reduced risk of developing depression. So we see this cross-sectionally, but we also see this across time. A roughly 30 to 35% reduction in the risk for developing depression. And so this is not explained by things like socioeconomic status and education and body size, body weight, or other health behaviours. We take all of these things into account and we still see these very clear dose-response relationships. It's not explained by reverse causality, so people eating differently because of their mental health problems. This is a prospective association. This is a very nice meta-analysis, and Tasneem was the senior author on this paper, bringing together all of the data to date, looking at this association, and it's very consistent. What's important to understand is this is also the case in young people, because half of mental disorders start before the age of 14. If we really want to care about prevention, we need to identify factors that can be modified to reduce risk. And in this regard, the fact that we see over and over again dose-response relationships between the diet quality of young people in those critical adolescent period when they're so vulnerable to developing mental health problems. And we see these associations even when we take into account factors such as family environment, family conflict, socioeconomic status. Critically, both things are important. Not having enough of the good foods, so these are the plant foods, vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, but also having an excessive amount of these ultra-processed foods. Foods that are taken apart, reconstituted, emulsifiers, additives, preservatives, colours, artificial sweeteners, etc., added nutrients. These foods and their consumption are associated over and over again with an increased risk. So both things are quite independent of each other, and particularly in young people, they're often getting healthful foods at home but then having these unhealthful foods when they're out, or even more concerningly when they're at school. And the opposite is often true too, where older people might not be having a lot of McDonald's or whatever the junk food is, but they're also having a very limited diet that doesn't have the fibre, the phytochemicals, all of the different healthful things that their body needs to function well. And then if we go right back to the very start of life, it's a very large body of evidence now showing that what mothers eat during pregnancy, as well as what children eat in the first few years of life, is related to their emotional and behavioural health. There are systematic literature reviews in the field. There's one at the top there. And we've also published quite often in this area. Our most recent work we did with the very large Norwegian mother and baby cohort study, more than 70,000 mothers and their children, and showed that mothers' diets, again, both a lower intake of the healthful foods, but also a higher intake of the ultra-processed foods, both associated with increased ADHD symptoms and diagnoses in their offspring. And we're very interested in how this might be working. But of course, the most critical thing is what we do at the population level. This is not just people of low socioeconomic status, low education. This is everyone. This is in Australia, 99% of 2- and 3-year-olds are not meeting the dietary guidelines for vegetables and legumes and these foods that are so critical to their health. Again, if we think about the factors that influence the risk for mental disorders across the life course, they're very often things that are difficult to change. So things like genetics, early life trauma, life stress, poverty, disadvantage, all of these things are often outside of people's control. The fact that lifestyle factors such as diet as well as exercise are things that people can modify themselves is very powerful knowledge, and it really can help people a lot to know that this is something that they can do for themselves. We also now have good evidence for dietary treatments for even severe clinical depression. So we ran the first randomised controlled trial in this field where we randomly assigned people with moderate to severe major depression. Many of them had been very sick for a long time. Most of them were on other forms of treatment, antidepressants, psychotherapy, etc. And they were randomly assigned to receive either nutritional consulting sessions with a clinical dietitian or social support, which we know is really helpful for people with depression, over a 12-week period. And what we saw was that those who were in the dietary nutritional counselling group, they experienced a very profound improvement in their depression, such that roughly 30% of them actually achieved full remission of their depression, remembering that these people had often been very sick for a long time. What we also saw was a very tight relationship between the degree to which they changed their diet and the degree to which their depression improved. Now that scale, it's called the MADRS, and the changes we saw were of a very, very large magnitude. So they weren't just little improvements, they were really large. The new analysis we've just done from the SMILES trial, looking at the specifics of diet and what actually changed and what was the thing that seemed to be the most powerful. We saw on average that people's MADRS score, this clinical measure of clinical depression, dropped by about 7 points on average, which is a lot. But for every 10% reduction in ultra-processed foods, there was an additional 2.5 point gain. So it seemed to be that reducing, whilst increasing your healthful food intake was really helpful, the really big thing that changed with the SMILES trial is people's intake of sweets and cakes and biscuits and ultra-processed food. And this seemed to have a very big impact. Now, there have been other trials that have shown very similar things. In the AMEND trial, the one that's at the top, this was done in young men with moderate to severe clinical depression. And again, we saw a big change in their depressive symptoms for those receiving the dietary support versus the social support. Another one, the Healthy Med trial, showed the same thing. And this is a much larger sample size than what we had. So there have been several trials in this area. What we also saw with our study was that there was a big cost saving, which has really large implications for the health services. So there was roughly $2,500 per participant cost saved through loss. People had less time out of their daily roles, and they also saw other health practitioners less often. So it seemed to be very, very cost effective. And the Healthy Med study also did a cost effectiveness analysis and showed the same thing. What we also did was a systematic literature review, meta-analysis, where we looked at all the studies where they had improved diet, they've targeted diet as an intervention in people with a range of disorders, such as metabolic conditions or cardiovascular disease, etc., but where they happen to have measured depression. And from this we see that these dietary interventions improve depressive symptoms even in people who don't have clinical depression. Our Food and Mood Centre program is really broad. So we set up the Food and Mood Centre in 2017 at the end of that year. So it's a relatively new centre, and then of course many of our activities were really interrupted by COVID. So we're only really just getting started. But as I mentioned, over the next 12 to 18 months, we're going to have a number of really important studies published, and we're doing a lot of work. And so the work that we do really spans the whole life course, from early life right towards the end of life and dementia. We look at things from the point of view of basic mechanisms, but also clinical trials, large-scale pragmatic trials, so trials that are done in the real world, implementation science, but then very importantly, education and training. And I'll talk more about that, and this relates to the Food and Mood Academy that Tatiana leads. I want to just point to the CALM trial. I made reference to these pragmatic trials. Pragmatic trials, they're also known as effectiveness trials, and basically they take trials out of just a purely scientific setting and just see what might happen in the real world. So as I mentioned, in Victoria, we had the longest lockdown pretty much anywhere in the world. And so there were very high rates of psychological distress in the community. Now, what we have in Australia, what we've managed to effect change in, which is the first time anywhere in the world, is the clinical practice guidelines that are set out by the peak mental health bodies. So in Australia, that's the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists. Their clinical practice guidelines for the treatment of mood disorders, so depression and bipolar disorder, now have essentially what is lifestyle medicine as the foundation of treatment. They call it foundational, they call it essentially non-negotiable. So that the first thing a practitioner should do when they have a patient with a mood disorder is address their diet, exercise, sleep, and smoking and other substance cessation before they do anything else. Now, I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment because obviously there's a problem there in terms of training. But one of the things that practitioners really want to understand is if I send my patient to see a clinical dietitian or an exercise physiologist instead of a psychiatrist, am I doing them a disservice? Am I disadvantaging them? And one of the reasons they might want to ask that question is because in Australia, as in many countries in the world, there's real pressure on the mental health workforce. There are not enough psychiatrists, there are not enough psychologists. So someone might be in great distress, but they might not have access to a practitioner. They might have to wait for several months to see someone. In that time, they could be sending their patient to a dietitian, but they want to know that they're not doing their patient a disservice. So what we did was we received funding to run what's called a non-inferiority trial. So here we're testing whether diet and exercise support delivered by professionals is at least as effective as gold standard psychotherapy delivered by psychologists. And because this was run during the lockdowns, we did it all online in group-based settings via telehealth. It was a very rigorous trial. We had very detailed manualised programs and we had a high level of fidelity checking. So it wasn't people just making things up on the spot. It was all very closely prescribed. And the beauty of this is that other people in other settings can actually take these manuals and take this information and apply it. They had 6 sessions over 7 weeks. Many of the patients were referred to us through the hospital, through the clinical psychiatry program, but others came through the general public. And we saw a wide range of people, everyone from long-standing schizophrenia right through to just elevated anxiety. And I can't give you away all the outcomes because this is under consideration for publication at the moment. But these are some of the safety data that might give you a bit of a hint as to what you might see when we come out. So is diet and exercise support at least as effective as gold standard psychotherapy? We think it might be. And this has big implications for clinical care, but also the mental health workforce in different countries and different settings. And again, pointing to the cost effectiveness of this approach. We're doing an economic evaluation as we speak, but we expect, based on the other studies that we've done, that it will be highly cost effective. We're very interested in the mechanisms that might link diet and nutrition to mental and brain health, and people always ask about this. This was an important expert review that we put together and published in 2020. And hopefully people can see this, but there's many ways in which what we eat influences our mental and brain health. And it makes sense that it's a multitude of ways because food is highly, highly complex. Now, nutrition has traditionally thought about food in terms of its components. So vitamins, minerals, macro and micronutrients, protein, fibre, carbohydrates. But what we're increasingly understanding is it's far, far more than that. If we think about our plant foods, which really should be the foundation of our diet, they have, what we know so far is maybe about 20,000 different phytochemicals that have been mapped. But we think that the actual number of phytochemicals in plant foods is as many as 150,000. Now, these are so complex, the way they interact with each other, with our health in our body, to even start to map them is extremely complex. Then you have the food matrix itself in food, and we're increasingly understanding that that is also really important. So these aspects of food are so complex and they influence the way our body works and our brain works in a multitude of different ways. But some of the ways that we're very interested in exploring and where we have good evidence is around the immune system. So many of you will have heard of this term of inflammation, this low-grade chronic activation of the immune system that seems to be so important in many chronic diseases, including mental disorders. And we know that diet has a big influence on inflammation. We see things like the mitochondria in our cells and how they work. Epigenetics, so the mechanisms that turn our genes on and off. Our stress response system. The tryptophan kynurenine pathway, that's the pathway, the mechanism that creates neurotransmitters and serotonin in the brain. And very importantly, the gut microbiota. And the gut microbiota we're particularly interested in because the gut and the microbes that live in the gut influence all these other pathways. And of course we can study it. We know it when you eat. It affects the gut microbiota within hours. So the gut microbiota are there to break down the aspects of food that our own human enzymes can't break down. And these are fibre, primarily plant fibre, that comes from vegetables, fruits, whole grain cereals, legumes, nuts, seeds, etc. And also these polyphenols, these phytochemicals that we take in plant food. And when they break them down, they produce thousands of different molecules. And these molecules interact with virtually every system in our body, including our brain. So if we don't eat enough fibre, which most people do not, or enough phytochemicals, then your gut microbes are not going to work terribly well. And Joelle will talk more about that. We've got a really extensive microbiome research program. We really focus on developing and implementing world-class standards. Very interested in the infant microbiome and how that might influence neurodevelopment, the oral microbiome and brain health and dementia. And we do clinical trials, we do epidemiology, and we're extending our focus from common mental disorders like depression to look at a whole host of other mental and brain disorders as well. We did a systematic literature review that was published last year in Molecular Psychiatry, where we looked at the microbes, the microbial composition of people with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression, compared to healthy people. And we see differences between people with mental disorders and without mental disorders. And when we looked across those disorders, we saw some concordance. We saw that people with mental disorders had lower levels of the bacteria that produce something called butyrate. Butyrate is very anti-inflammatory. It's a really important short-chain fatty acid produced by the microbes that interacts with our immune system. 70% of the body's immune cells are actually in the gut. It's like the engine room of our immune system. So they had lower levels of these butyrate-producing bacteria. Butyrate is produced by the bacteria when it breaks down dietary fibre from plants. We saw changes in bacteria that produce GABA, which is involved in many mental disorders, and also increases in lactic acid-producing bacteria. Now, in all of these mental disorders, we see increases in lactic acid and lactate in the brain, in the blood, in a way that we think is involved in the illness itself. So all of these bacteria, we don't know whether it's cause or effect, but based on some of the studies where stool is taken from someone with major depression or with schizophrenia and put into an animal, a rodent, and it can induce the behavioural phenotype of depression or schizophrenia. It can induce some of the biochemical changes that we see in those conditions. For these reasons, we think that the microbes might be involved in a way that actually influences mental health. We're very interested in how we might target the infant microbiota through targeting the diet of the mother. So we've done some really interesting research. Firstly, we've seen that the diet of mums seems to be related to the emotional health of the children via their microbes. Mothers who have healthier diets have more diversity of their gut microbiota, and this seems to be a good marker of a healthy gut. And then their children seem to have lower levels of emotional behavioural problems. We also see that in infants at 1, the presence of a particular bacteria that we know is more prevalent in people who eat a lot of dietary fibre, that seemed to be very protective against developing emotional behavioural problems. And we also ran a randomised controlled trial of women when they were pregnant, getting them to eat more fibre, more fermented foods, improve their diet quality, and we see that their infants have a different microbial profile to the infants whose mothers didn't get that intervention. Now, this is important because the infant microbiome, we know it's very involved in priming and developing the immune system of infants, setting them up really for their life, but we also think that it's involved in neurodevelopment, development of the brain in those early stages of life. So we're developing a digital app that can be used for women who are pregnant, and we've just got some funding to run it as a clinical trial. I mentioned gut diversity. So if you think about the gut microbiome as like a rainforest, ideally a healthy rainforest is very diverse. It has many, many different species that work synergistically. It has microbes in the soil, bacteria, fungi. It has different types of creatures and plants that are working synergistically to support each other. And it means that it's a very resilient system. You think about a monoculture that is very vulnerable to like a single virus, parasite, something coming through and wiping it out. It's less resilient because it's less diverse. And what we see over and over again is that people who have healthier diets have a more diverse gut bacteria, and that in turn is associated with cancer, frailty, that means as we age, our cognitive health and many other aspects of our health, metabolic disease, type 2 diabetes, Crohn's disease, many different conditions. You see people have lower bacterial diversity in their gut. In cancer, it seems to be particularly important in predicting how well people will respond to treatments. Everything from stem cells to chemotherapy to immunotherapy, and they're now doing fecal transplants in people with cancer, and I think Joelle will talk more about that shortly. If we think about changes to our food system, our global food system now accounts for $20 trillion per year in costs to the planet. 20 trillion. By comparison, China's whole GDP is 16 trillion a year. So 20 trillion, this is from the UN Food Summit report, 11 trillion of that is the impact on our health, 7 trillion on the environment. And those two things are absolutely interconnected because the loss of biodiversity, which is, in the global food industry, is the leading cause of the loss of biodiversity in the environment, is directly linked to the loss of biodiversity in us, in our microbes. And if you think about the sorts of foods we used to eat and how diverse our diets were, and they've become less and less and less and less diverse, and more processed and sanitised and full of antibiotics. And along with that, we now have this massive increase in allergic diseases, such as asthma and eczema and these types of things, but also autoimmune conditions, type 1 diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, all of these tracking along with this loss of biodiversity. Remember, the gut is the engine of our immune system. It trains our immune system in infancy. The things we are doing to our gut means that our immune systems are really compromised. There's some very nice studies where they've looked at people immigrating from areas with a more traditional food culture into the US, and they see a progressive loss of diversity in the gut as their food becomes more and more industrialised, alongside an increase in metabolic conditions and a whole host of other conditions. We're very interested in fermented foods. Fermented foods have been used traditionally through societies all over the world. If you think about what your gut microbiota do when you consume food, if you're ideally consuming fibre and polyphenols and these sorts of things, they're making their way to the large bowel. The gut bacteria are fermenting them, breaking them down, producing these thousands of really important bioactive molecules that interact with all these systems in the body. With fermented foods, they're doing the same thing, but they're doing it in a bottle or a jar. So if you are taking fermented foods, you're not just getting bacteria, alive or dead, but you're getting all the products of those bacteria, all the fermentation products, and we think that they're really powerful. We've just finished a trial, 8 weeks, healthy women receiving either fermented dairy, like a yogurt drink, or a placebo fermented dairy drink. They didn't know which they were getting. We've done brain scans on them. We've profiled a whole host of their bio samples. And we've seen really important effects on the brain. And again, these data are just being analysed and will be published later this year. But just 8 weeks of dairy, once a day, fermented dairy, seems to have really profound influence on the brain. And we're just not eating anywhere near enough of these foods. We're very interested in neurogenesis. There's this key region of the brain, it's the one region we know of that actually puts on new neurons throughout life. It's called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a very important seat of learning and memory. It's sort of like one of your engine houses of your brain power. It's also involved in mental health. It shrinks. For many people who are depressed, they have a smaller hippocampus. As they recover, their hippocampus grows again. Many things influence the hippocampus, including diet. And diet affects it really quite quickly. So there's a lot of very interesting studies. Some, in fact, by colleagues of ours in Australia have shown that only a few days of a junk food type diet or Western type diet in young, healthy people affects hippocampal related memory tasks. Just 4 days. On the other hand, if you have a healthier diet, you have a larger hippocampus. This graph hasn't translated very well, but actually the gradient is very sharp. People who have a poor diet, and these are in older people, where we've scanned their brains, looked at their hippocampus, very clear dose-response relationship between the size of their hippocampus and the healthfulness of their diet. And it wasn't just a little bit of an effect. it was equivalent to about 60% of the shrinkage that we generally see in people's hippocampi as they get older, that's associated with those memory losses. So it's saying that diet is really, really important. And again, Tasneem led another study, much larger than ours, in the Whitehall 2 cohort that showed the same thing. And then there's an even larger study from the Rotterdam study that shows the same thing. So what we see in the animal studies, where you can manipulate diet, manipulate the hippocampus, seems to be true in adults, in humans as well. We're very interested in how we might use fecal transplants, poo transplants, to help people. And I know Joel will be talking about this as well. We have some remarkable case studies published where people have had, for example, bipolar disorder for 15 years more, very unwell, in and out of hospital, and having an FMT, they have been completely cured and well for many years. Of course, case studies are not really good evidence, so we need to do clinical trials. We've just finished a feasibility trial where people with moderate to severe major depression were randomly assigned to get either fecal transplant from very healthy donors or a placebo fecal transplant. And we've shown that it was feasible. People were very happy to receive all of those enemas. We had no serious or adverse events. And what we saw, even though it was a tiny, tiny sample, was improvements in gut symptoms and quality of life. So now we're trying to get funding to do a far larger study because we think that this may have some real potential to help people with even very severe mental disorders. Again, when we think about these determinants of mental health, there are many, many things in the environment, but part of them are commercial determinants of mental health because, as I said, our industrialised food environment that's changed everything from the way our crops are grown, the impact on the microbes in our soil, which are responsible for getting those phytochemicals and nutrients into plants, our livestock production, and the foods that we're given, these highly processed foods that are taken apart and reconstituted with all sorts of things in them. All of these things have had a major, the biggest impact on our health right across the globe. And getting individuals to change their diet in the face of a food environment where everywhere you go, even just filling up the car with petrol, you're faced with opportunities to consume these foods that interact with the reward systems of the brain. They're very hard to stop eating once you start. And we've seen actually that people will eat more of ultra-processed foods when they're given them without even realising, because they seem to affect our appetite regulation systems. And some of the work that's been done suggests that this is happening through the hippocampus, because that is one of the regions of the brain that controls appetite, but also the reward systems of the brain. So changing the industrialised food environment is really important. We're doing a lot of policy work now and working with policymakers around the world through this International Brain Alliance that Marion is also involved in, which is very encouraging, and also the World Economic Forum's New Frontiers in Nutrition initiative, on which I'm on the steering committee for that, where we're really wanting to refocus the conversation on brain health and gut health rather than metabolic health. Because in public health, we've been talking about body size and body weight for decades. Now, it's a really silly thing to focus on. Apart from the fact that it's stigmatising, so many things influence body size, and it's very difficult to reverse. So people give up. They find that they don't respond to those messages around food anymore. They think, I can't give up, I can't lose weight, or I can't keep it off if I do lose weight, so I'm just going to switch off to those messages. Whereas our research shows that if you focus the message and the knowledge on mental and brain health, people really respond to it. And it's so important to understand that this link between diet and mental health does not involve body weight. In our SMILES trial, when we change people's diets and they experience such a huge, profound improvement in their mental health, their body size didn't change. This was not a weight loss diet. So you focus the message on nurturing, on health, on growing the brain, improving mental and brain health, and people respond to it, and they do change their diet. If you focus it on the gut, something very concrete and simple that people can understand, that also really helps them to change their dietary behaviours. So refocusing the message is very important. But as I mentioned, doctors, medical practitioners, they receive almost no nutrition training throughout their degree. And this is a major gap. And one of our colleagues did a terrific review looking at psychiatrists and psychologists right across the world and showing that nearly 75% of psychiatrists reported no training in nutrition. Less than 1% rated their nutrition education as very good. Yet nearly 60% were recommending supplements and more than 40% recommending specific diet strategies without actually knowing what the evidence base was. So we saw this very big gap. And even though it's very difficult to fund, and we're dependent on philanthropic funding to do it, we've developed a whole program of training and education through the Food and Mood Academy, which is led by Dr. Tetiana Rox here. So our original Food and Mood free online course has been one of the most successful in the world. It's enrolled more than 80,000 students from more than 190 countries around the world. And then we work very closely with our Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatry and developed accredited endorsed training for psychiatrists and other medical professionals that is now available online and taken up by practitioners all over the world. So Tetiana will be talking more about these, but certainly if people are interested in doing this, it's a really fantastic resource. My husband and I have written a children's book, which again, if you've got young people in your life, is a really fantastic way to get them to think about their food, because kids are really smart. And if they understand this idea that they have a zoo in their gut, that's wonderful, like it has all of these warriors that keep them well and run their immune system and everything else, and what they need to feed it, they really get it. And then they start to make good dietary choices. I wrote a book in 2019 that just gives people a background on nutritional psychiatry and sort of how it came into being, if people would like to know more. And now I'm going to be able to hand over to Dr. Rox to talk about how you can take this knowledge and get it into your daily practices. So I hope you found that interesting. There's a lot that I couldn't cover, of course, today, but it's a very interesting field.